Thomas Mitchell had been standing guard at Kensington Palace for 12 years. Every morning at 6 sharp, he would put on his crisp uniform, polish his boots until they shone like mirrors, and take his position by the main entrance. His back was always straight, his eyes always alert, and his face showed no emotion. That was how a royal guard should be. Thomas loved his job more than anything else in the world. As a child growing up in a small village outside London, he had dreamed of serving the royal family. His father had been a police officer, and his grandfather had served in the army during World War II. Service was in his blood. When Thomas was 25, he finally got the call he had been waiting for. The palace was looking for new guards, and his application had been accepted. He remembered that day clearly. His mother had cried with joy, and his father had shaken his hand with pride in his eyes. Now, at 37, Thomas knew every stone of the palace grounds. He knew which tourists would try to get too close to the gates, which photographers were regulars, and exactly how many steps it took to walk from his post to the main door. He had protected the royal family through public events, private gatherings, and quiet family moments. Thomas had seen Prince George grow from a tiny baby to a curious 10-year-old boy. The young prince often played in the palace gardens, always under the watchful eye of his protection officers. Thomas had strict orders never to interact with the royal children, unless there was danger, and he followed those orders perfectly. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, the London sky was grey and cold rain was falling. Thomas stood at his usual post, water dripping from the edge of his hat. His feet were getting cold, but he did not move. A royal guard never complained about the weather. Prince George was supposed to have a private tutoring session that morning, but Thomas could see him looking out of one of the palace windows. The boy seemed restless, pressing his face against the glass and drawing shapes in the fog his breath made. Thomas kept his eyes forward, but he could see the prince in his peripheral vision. Around 10:30, something unusual happened. Prince George appeared at a side door of the palace, dressed in his school clothes but carrying a steaming mug in his small hands. He looked around nervously, then walked slowly toward Thomas's post. This had never happened before. Thomas felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he kept his position. Protocol was clear. He should alert the prince's protection officers immediately if any royal family member approached his post unexpectedly. But something made him hesitate. The boy looked different today. His usual bright smile was missing, and his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that no 10-year-old should bear. Prince George stopped about 3 feet away from Thomas and stood there for a moment, just looking at him. The rain was getting heavier, and small drops were starting to soak through the boy's school jumper. "You must be very cold," Prince George said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. Thomas almost broke protocol right then. Every instinct told him to respond, to reassure the young prince that he was fine. But his training held firm. He stared straight ahead and said nothing. Prince George took a step closer. "I made this for you," he said, extending the mug toward Thomas. "It's hot chocolate. My nanny helped me make it. But it was my idea." The gesture hit Thomas like a physical blow. In 12 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever offered him anything. They were kind and polite when circumstances required interaction. But this was different. This was pure, innocent thoughtfulness. Thomas could smell the hot chocolate, rich and sweet, with hints of cinnamon. His hands were so cold he could barely feel them, and his whole body was chilled through. The warm mug would have felt like heaven, but he could not take it. The rules were clear. Royal guards did not accept gifts. They did not eat or drink while on duty. They did not interact personally with the royal family. Prince George stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. When Thomas did not respond, the boy's face fell. Not with anger or frustration, but with genuine sadness. "I just thought," Prince George started, then stopped. He looked down at the mug in his hands, then back up at Thomas's face. "You're always out here, in the rain and the cold. I thought you might be thirsty." Thomas felt something break inside his chest. This was not about protocol or rules or proper behavior. This was about a kind child who had noticed another human being's discomfort and wanted to help. And Thomas was rejecting that kindness because of regulations written in some manual. Prince George waited another moment, hope flickering in his eyes. When Thomas still did not move or speak, the boy nodded slowly, as if he understood something that he should not have to understand at his age. "That's okay," Prince George said softly. "I understand you have important work to do." He turned to walk back toward the palace, still carrying the mug. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back. "Thank you for keeping us safe," he said. "I know it's not easy." Then he walked back inside, leaving Thomas standing in the rain with tears mixing with raindrops on his face. For the first time in 12 years of service, Thomas Mitchell questioned whether following the rules was always the right thing to do. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Thomas stood his post, performed his duties, and followed every protocol exactly as he had been trained. But something fundamental had changed inside him. Every time he thought about Prince George's disappointed face, his chest tightened with an emotion he could not name. That evening, Thomas went home to his small flat in South London. He lived alone. His job demands had made it difficult to maintain relationships. He heated up a frozen dinner, sat in his favorite chair, and tried to watch television, but he could not concentrate. He kept thinking about the hot chocolate. Not the drink itself, but what it represented. A 10-year-old boy had seen him standing in the cold rain and had felt moved to help. That level of empathy and kindness was remarkable in anyone, but in a future king who could have anything he wanted, it was extraordinary. Thomas realized that in protecting Prince George's physical safety, the protocols might be damaging something more important. The boy's natural compassion. How many other kind impulses had been discouraged by the rigid formality required around the royal family? As Thomas lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he began to understand something that would change everything. The rules he had followed so faithfully for 12 years were designed to protect the royal family from harm. But they were also creating invisible barriers between them and the very people they would one day serve. Prince George had offered him hot chocolate not because he was a prince, but because he was a caring human being who noticed when someone else was uncomfortable. And Thomas had been forced to reject that kindness not because it was inappropriate, but because tradition demanded it. For the first time since joining the Royal Guard, Thomas Mitchell fell asleep wondering if there might be a better way to serve his country than standing silently in the rain, unable to accept a cup of hot chocolate from a kind child. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the palace as usual. But everything felt different. The familiar stone walls and iron gates looked the same. Yet he saw them through new eyes. As he took his position, he found himself glancing toward the window where Prince George had stood the day before. The incident with the hot chocolate played over and over in Thomas's mind like a movie he could not stop watching. He had barely slept, and when he did manage to drift off, he dreamed of disappointed young faces and cold mugs sitting untouched on windowsills. Around midday, Thomas noticed increased activity near the family's private quarters. Prince George was leaving for his weekly riding lesson at the Royal Mews. As the young prince walked past with his instructor, he caught sight of Thomas at his post. Their eyes met for just a moment. Prince George gave a small, polite nod, the same gesture he had been taught to give all palace staff. But Thomas saw something else in the boy's expression, a sadness that had not been there before yesterday. The natural warmth in Prince George's smile seemed dimmed, replaced by a more formal, distant politeness. It was exactly what Thomas had feared. The boy was learning to build walls. During his lunch break, Thomas sat in the staff quarters, staring at his sandwich without eating. His colleague, David Harrison, noticed his unusual silence. "You look like someone died, mate," David said, settling into the chair across from him. David had been a palace guard for 8 years, and was one of the few people Thomas considered a real friend. Thomas hesitated, then told David what had happened with Prince George. He expected his friend to laugh or maybe remind him about protocol. Instead, David's expression grew serious. "Bloody hell," David said quietly. "The little prince made you hot chocolate?" David 7. His nanny helped. "But it was his idea," Thomas said. "David, you should have seen his face when I could not take it." He looked like I had slapped him. David was quiet for a long moment, stirring his tea thoughtfully. You know what the worst part is? He finally said. In a few years, he will stop trying to be kind like that. The system will teach him that ordinary people like us are not supposed to matter to him personally. That's what I keep thinking about, Thomas said. We are supposed to be protecting him, but are we protecting his humanity? The conversation stayed with Thomas through the afternoon. As he stood at his post, he watched the palace staff going about their duties. Everyone was polite and professional, but there was an invisible distance between them and the royal family. It was subtle but real, a formality that prevented genuine human connection. Thomas began to remember other moments over the years, times when he had seen genuine kindness in the royal children's eyes, only to watch it gradually fade as they learned the proper way to behave around staff. He thought about Princess Charlotte's natural friendliness being slowly replaced with royal reserve, and Prince Louis's curious questions about the guards being gently discouraged. That evening, Thomas did something he had never done before. Instead of going straight home, he walked through Hyde Park, thinking, London was beautiful in the early winter twilight, with street lamps beginning to glow and people hurrying home from work. He found himself on a bench near the Serpentine, watching families with their children. A little girl, probably around Prince George's age, was feeding ducks with her father. When she ran out of bread, she turned to a nearby jogger and asked if he had any food for the ducks. The jogger smiled, pulled an apple from his pocket, and helped her break it into pieces. It was such a simple interaction, but it struck Thomas powerfully. This was how normal children learned to connect with other people. They were not taught that there were barriers between themselves and others. They learned that kindness was natural and good, and that most people would respond warmly to genuine gestures of care. Prince George would never have that freedom. Every interaction in his life would be filtered through protocol and security concerns. Thomas suddenly understood that the boy's gesture with the hot chocolate had not just been kindness. It had been a small act of rebellion against the artificial barriers being built around him. The realization hit Thomas like cold water. He was not just a guard protecting Prince George from physical danger. He was part of a system that was slowly isolating the future king from the very people he would one day serve. Every time Thomas stood rigid and silent while Prince George tried to connect, he was teaching the boy that human warmth had no place in royal life. Thomas thought about his own childhood. His father had been a police officer, a man dedicated to serving others. But when young Thomas had tried to give his father's partner a homemade biscuit during a community event, his father had encouraged it. He had explained later that serving the public meant remembering they were all human beings deserving of respect and kindness. How different that was from the world Prince George was growing up in, where kindness toward staff was seen as inappropriate rather than admirable. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself observing the royal family differently. He watched Prince William and Princess Catherine with their children, noting how they tried to maintain some normalcy while still preparing their children for royal responsibilities. He could see the careful balance they were trying to strike, but he also saw how the rigid protocols of palace life were slowly winning. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. Prince George was walking through the main corridor with his tutor when he dropped his pencil case. Pens and erasers scattered across the marble floor. Thomas was nearby, having just finished escorting a visitor to the main entrance. Instinctively, Thomas stepped forward to help gather the scattered items. But before he could take more than 2 steps, Prince George's protection officer gestured for him to stop. The message was clear. It was not appropriate for a guard to help with such a minor matter. Prince George looked up from where he was crawling on the floor, collecting his things. His eyes met Thomas's, and in that moment, both of them understood exactly what was happening. The boy was learning that help from certain people was not acceptable, even when it was freely offered. Thomas stepped back, returning to his position. Prince George finished gathering his belongings alone, then stood up and continued down the corridor with his tutor. He did not look back. That incident crystallized everything Thomas had been feeling since the hot chocolate moment. He was not protecting Prince George from harm. He was protecting him from humanity. Every rule that prevented natural, kind interactions was building walls around a boy who would one day need to understand and connect with all kinds of people. That night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a pen and paper. He began writing a letter. Not his resignation, not yet, but his thoughts about what he had observed and what he believed was at stake. The future king learns about leadership not just from textbooks and formal training, he wrote, but from every daily interaction. If those interactions are cold and distant, what kind of leader will he become? Thomas thought about all the guards and staff who had served the royal family over the centuries. Most had followed the rules exactly as written, maintaining proper distance and formal behavior. But had any of them ever wondered what effect this had on the people they served? He thought about Prince George 20 years from now. As an adult, would he remember the guard who had accepted his hot chocolate with gratitude? Or the one who had stood like a statue while a child's kindness went unacknowledged? Which memory would serve him better as a future king? By the time Thomas finished writing, it was past midnight. He had filled several pages with his observations and concerns. Reading back through what he had written, he realized he had reached a conclusion that would change everything. The royal family did not need guards who followed every protocol blindly. They needed people who understood that protecting someone meant protecting not just their physical safety, but their ability to remain connected to their humanity. And sometimes, that might mean accepting a cup of hot chocolate from a 10-year-old boy who just wanted to help. On Monday morning, Thomas requested a meeting with Captain Edwards, the head of palace security. It was unusual for a guard to ask for such a meeting, and Thomas could see the surprise in his supervisor's eyes when the request was approved. Captain Edwards was a stern man in his 50s who had been with the palace security team for over 20 years. His office was small but neat, with certificates and commendations covering one wall. He gestured for Thomas to sit in the chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you, Mitchell?" Captain Edwards asked, looking at Thomas with the same attention he gave to security briefings. Thomas had rehearsed this conversation many times, but now that he was here, the words felt heavy in his mouth. "Sir, I need to discuss my position here at the palace. Is there a problem with your duties? Your performance has been exemplary." "Thank you, sir. The problem is not with my duties, but with my understanding of what those duties should include." Thomas told Captain Edwards about the incident with Prince George and the hot chocolate. He explained his growing concerns about the impact of rigid protocols on the royal children's development. Captain Edwards listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the story continued. When Thomas finished, the office was silent for a long moment. Captain Edwards leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas carefully. "Mitchell, I understand your concerns," he said finally. "But these protocols exist for important reasons. Security, proper hierarchy, maintaining appropriate boundaries. These things matter. I agree they matter, sir. But I think we need to consider what we might be losing in the process." Captain Edwards sighed. "You are talking about changing traditions that have been in place for generations. The royal family has always maintained a certain distance from staff. It is not personal. It is simply how things are done." "But what if how things are done is not serving the royal family well?" Thomas asked. "Prince George will be king someday. Should not his preparation include learning how to connect with all kinds of people?" The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Captain Edwards was not dismissive of Thomas's concerns, but he made it clear that individual guards could not simply decide which protocols to follow and which to ignore. The system was larger than any one person's opinions. As Thomas left the office, he knew what he had to do. That evening, he wrote his formal resignation letter. It was brief and professional, giving the required 2 weeks' notice, without detailing his reasons beyond personal conviction. The next morning, as Thomas took his post for what would be one of his final times, he saw Prince George in the garden with his siblings. The children were playing a simple game of tag, their laughter carrying across the grounds. For a moment, Prince George looked like any other 10-year-old boy, carefree and happy. But then Thomas noticed how the boys' protection officers maintained their careful distance, how the nannies ensured no interaction with palace staff, how even this innocent play was surrounded by invisible barriers. Prince George would never have the experience of asking a groundskeeper about the flowers, or thanking a maintenance worker for fixing something, or simply chatting with the people who worked to make his life comfortable. During his lunch break that day, Thomas was surprised to receive a message that Princess Catherine wanted to speak with him. This was unprecedented. Members of the royal family did not typically request meetings with individual guards. Thomas was escorted to a small sitting room he had never been in before. Princess Catherine was there alone, which was also unusual. She stood when he entered, and for a moment, Thomas was not sure of the proper protocol for this situation. "Please, sit down," she said gently, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to thank you for your years of service before you leave us." Thomas felt his face flush. Word of his resignation had obviously reached the family. "Your Royal Highness, it has been an honor to serve." "Captain Edwards told me about your concerns," Princess Catherine said carefully. "About the interaction with George and the hot chocolate." Thomas tensed, wondering if he was about to be criticized for discussing the incident. "I want you to know that William and I have had similar concerns," she continued. "We struggle daily with balancing our children's security needs with our desire for them to have normal experiences and develop natural empathy." This was not what Thomas had expected to hear. Princess Catherine looked tired, and he realized that she and Prince William were fighting the same battle he had been wrestling with. "But from the other side, George told me about the hot chocolate," she said quietly. "He was quite upset that you could not accept it. Not because you had rejected him personally, but because he realized there were rules preventing human kindness. That is a difficult lesson for a 10-year-old. I am sorry, Your Royal Highness. I never wanted to hurt him." "You did not hurt him," Princess Catherine said firmly. "You helped him understand something important about the world he lives in. But Thomas, may I call you Thomas? Your resignation will not change the system. It will just remove one person who actually cares about these issues." They talked for 20 minutes. Princess Catherine explained some of the security concerns that drove the protocols, but she also acknowledged that some traditions might need to evolve. She asked if Thomas would consider staying and working with palace leadership to find ways to maintain security while allowing more natural interactions. Thomas was tempted. The idea of being part of positive change was appealing, but he had thought deeply about this decision, and his mind was made up. "Your Royal Highness, I believe someone needs to step away and say publicly that these protocols are not serving the royal family well. If I stay, I become part of a system I can no longer fully support. If I leave and explain why, maybe it will start important conversations." Princess Catherine nodded slowly. "I understand, and I want you to know that your concerns are being heard. Change in an institution like this is slow, but it does happen." Thomas worked his final 2 weeks with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. On his last day, something unexpected happened. As he was preparing to leave the palace for the final time, Prince George appeared with his protection officer. "I wanted to say goodbye," the young prince said formally, but then he stepped closer and lowered his voice. "And I wanted you to know that I understand why you could not take the hot chocolate. But thank you for wanting to." It was a remarkably mature statement from a 10-year-old, and Thomas realized that Prince George was learning to navigate the complex world he had been born into, with more wisdom than most adults possessed. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, bending down to the boy's level, "never stop caring about other people. That is what will make you a great king someday." Prince George smiled, a real, warm smile that reminded Thomas why he had been willing to give up his career for this principle. 3 months after leaving the palace, Thomas gave an interview to a respected journalist. He spoke carefully and respectfully about his time as a royal guard, but he also shared his concerns about the impact of excessive formality on the royal children's development. The story generated significant discussion in the media and among royal watchers. Some criticized Thomas for speaking out, but many others praised his courage in raising important questions about balancing tradition with human connection. 6 months later, Thomas noticed small changes being reported in royal coverage. Prince George was seen chatting briefly with staff during public events. Princess Charlotte was photographed thanking a groundskeeper who had helped retrieve her ball. These were tiny moments, but they suggested that conversations were happening within the palace walls. Thomas had found a new job as a security consultant for schools, work that felt meaningful and aligned with his values. He sometimes missed the prestige and history of palace service, but he never regretted his decision. On quiet evenings, Thomas often thought about that rainy Tuesday morning when a 10-year-old boy had offered him hot chocolate. It had been such a small gesture, but it had changed everything. Prince George had shown more leadership in that moment than many adults ever would, seeing a need and trying to address it, offering kindness without expecting anything in return. Thomas hoped that wherever Prince George's life led him, he would remember that morning too, not as a lesson about protocol and proper behavior, but as a reminder that true leadership begins with caring about the well-being of others, no matter who they are or where they stand in the world. The boy who had wanted to give hot chocolate to a cold guard would someday be king, and perhaps, because someone had been willing to step away from a job to honor that kindness, he would be a king who remembered that his greatest duty was not to traditions or protocols, but to the people he served.